adrenergic receptors, and these are receptors that respond to epinephrine or norepinephrine. Okay, and norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter, and epinephrine is released by the adrenal medulla. So, again, if we think about, and these are found in these receptors are going to be typically found in the target organs of the sympathetic nervous system. So, if we remember, in the sympathetic nervous system, we have a preganglionic neuron with its axon that's pretty short, right? It ends right about there, and then that will stimulate a postganglionic fiber or neuron. It's a little bit longer, okay? And if we remember that preganglionic neuron, it's going to release neurotransmitter acetylcholine in the synapse. So that's acetylcholine. And then typically, after this postsynaptic fiber is stimulated, it's going to release another neurotransmitter, norepinephrine, into the synapse right before the target organ. And we could just say this is the heart. Now, the one exception to this is the sweat glands. So the postsynaptic fiber that innervates the sweat glands, it's still part of the sympathetic nervous system, that will release acetylcholine. But all the other postsynaptic fibers of the sympathetic nervous system will release norepinephrine onto the target organ, whether it be like the heart or the blood vessels or the lungs or whatever organ we're talking about. So, but the point is that just the simple release of norepinephrine onto that target organ, that doesn't determine the effect that this neurotransmitter has on that organ. It's all about the receptors that will bind to and receive that neurotransmitter, norepinephrine. The specific receptors is what determines what effect that has on the organ. So if we were to kind of blow this up like this, let's say we have a pretty large, this is the axon terminal of the postsynaptic fiber for the sympathetic nervous system, and it's releasing all this norepinephrine into the synapse. Okay. I'm going to draw one. We'll say this is a cell of a target organ, and that cell could have one of 5 different types of receptors. The first type of receptor, they're called beta 1 receptors. Okay, these are typically found in predominantly in the heart, but also in the kidneys and adipose tissue. So they're found in the heart, but also the kidneys and in fat. Now what happens is when the heart, when you have beta 1 receptors in the cell membrane of those heart cells that receive that sympathetic input, and when those beta 1 receptors bind on a norepinephrine, this causes the heart rate to increase. So this increases not only the heart rate, but it also increases how strongly the heart is contracting. So it increases stroke volume. And if you add these two together, this is a topic for the cardiovascular system, but all of these guys are going to increase how much blood the heart pumps over a given amount of time, and that's called cardiac output. So it's going to increase cardiac output. And that makes sense, when the sympathetic system is most active, we need to increase the amount of blood that the heart is pumping, and this is one way that's accomplished. These beta 1 receptors in the heart, they receive norepinephrine, and that increases heart rate and stroke volume, which is how strongly the heart is contracting. In the kidneys, when beta 1 receptors in the kidneys are stimulated by norepinephrine, this causes the kidneys to release a hormone called renin, and renin kind of causes a pretty complicated sequence of events, but ultimately renin increases blood pressure. So you can see that both of these two together are really triggering an increased speed of blood going through the body, which is needed when the sympathetic system is active. Okay. The second type of receptor, here's another cell from a target organ. These guys are called beta 2 receptors. All right, and these beta 2 receptors are pretty much found in most target organs of the sympathetic nervous system, but also the lungs. They're in high concentration in the lungs and also the blood vessels. Okay. So one thing about this is that when these beta 2 receptors are kind of stimulated, when they bind onto norepinephrine in the lungs, this causes bronchial dilation. Right? And that's going to be necessary during sympathetic activity that dilates the bronchioles, that allows more air to come in so that we can increase the rate of gas exchange in the lungs so that the tissues in the blood can obviously receive more oxygen. Now, one interesting thing about this is that albuterol is a drug that is used to treat asthma attacks. This albuterol simulates the effect of norepinephrine, and it will activate these beta 2 receptors, which will also called bronchial dilation, which is exactly what you would want when you're having an asthma attack. An asthma attack is when you get this inflammation within the bronchioles and your airways start to constrict. Well, this drug albuterol is going to bind to these beta 2 receptors, which causes bronchial dilation and hopefully can alleviate that attack. Okay. Now, when we're talking about the blood vessels that contain these beta 2 receptors, when they bind on to norepinephrine, they're also going to cause dilation of that vessel. So as you notice, most of these beta 2 receptors, when they're stimulated, they have an inhibitory effect. In other words, they relax muscle contraction. Oh, and one more thing about beta 1 receptors, the drugs called beta blockers that are used to treat high blood pressure and they're used to treat high blood pressure, hypertension. Basically, these beta blockers will deactivate the beta 1 receptors so that the sympathetic nervous system cannot as effectively raise blood pressure and heart rate and stroke volume, which also increases blood pressure. So in other words, they deactivate these beta receptors so that the blood pressure will decrease. Right? Next, we have another type of receptor called beta 3 receptors. And again, all these receptors are only stimulated by norepinephrine. Okay, these beta 3 receptors, these guys are found in adipose tissue, in fat cells. And when these beta 3 receptors are, when they are stimulated by norepinephrine, that triggers lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat cells into energy. It makes sense. During sympathetic activity, we need to convert that fat cell to energy. Okay. Our fourth type of receptor, okay, these are our alpha 1 receptors. Okay, these are basically found in all of our sympathetic organs, okay, especially the blood vessels and the kidneys and salivary glands. Blood vessels, kidneys, salivary glands. Okay. Let's see. All right. And what these guys do is when they are stimulated by norepinephrine, these guys will constrict blood vessels associated with these vessels here. They will cause constriction. Right? And they will also cause the salivary glands to constrict. So they will cause constriction here. Right. Now, The final type of receptor is called alpha-2 receptors. All right, now these alpha-2 receptors, these are actually found in the membrane of the adrenergic axon terminals. Okay, so these are actually found within this little membrane right here. And what these guys do is they inhibit the release of norepinephrine from these very same terminals where this axon terminal is releasing the norepinephrine through this vesicle fusion. Norepinephrine is diffusing into the synapse. Well, when these alpha-2 receptors bind onto norepinephrine, they stop that norepinephrine from being released from the presynaptic terminal. Okay, so they stop norepinephrine release. So you can imagine that drugs that stimulate this, that stimulate these alpha-2 receptors, they're going to decrease the effect of the sympathetic nervous system. They simply have an effect on the body where we lower heart rate, lower blood pressure, can even be caused as an anesthetic.